Let me welcome all of you on behalf of the university to what is the sixth in a series of Suffolk University Boston Globe political happy hours. This has been a great series for people who have watched this, for us to be able to present it along with our partners, the Boston Globe. I'd also like to welcome those of you watching online on bostonglobe.com. We are delighted tonight to have Senate President Stanley Rosenberg as the guest in this particular political happy hour. Senator Rosenberg is no stranger, I'm sure, to anybody in this room. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1987, and 4 years later became a state senator. He is now the 93rd president of the Massachusetts State Senate. He has been a champion for all the issues that are important to so many of us here at Suffolk University: higher education, early childhood education, equality, the environment. On all those issues, Senate President Stan Rosenberg has been there. So let's get to this interview. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn this over to Josh Miller of the Boston Globe and Senate President Stanley Rosenberg.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, everyone who's joining us here at Suffolk University, everyone who's joining us online at bostonglobe.com, and thanks to Suffolk University for hosting us. And I hope everyone will sign up for the newsletter from which this event takes its name at bostonglobe.com/political happy hour. But most of all, I want to welcome the Senate President of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Stan Rosenberg. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Happy to be here. I'd love to spend a happy hour with you.
Well, we're about to. I want to start by asking you this. You're Jewish in a state house that's predominantly Catholic. You're a gay man on a mostly straight Beacon Hill, and you're from Western Massachusetts in a state where political heft rests around Boston. I think it seems fair to say that your rise from being a foster child to one of the three most powerful people on Beacon Hill is decidedly improbable. How did you get there?
I worked hard, and I convinced a lot of people to vote for me, and then to vote for me again and again and again.
Does it get easier the second time around?
Absolutely, it actually does.
It was your second time vying for the Senate presidency, is that right?
Correct.
What made you try again?
I just loved being in the legislature, and I decided to stay because Senate President Travellini encouraged me to stay, and then Senate President Murray did the same and gave me some meaningful assignments. I was there for a long period of time, and there was a transition moment coming, and some people, unlike the first time when I put myself forward as a candidate, this time people came to me and said, "We think that you ought to run for Senate President."
How did you win the inside game?
How did I win the inside? By getting 17 votes in the Democratic caucus.
No, I understand that was the final outcome, but what was the process by which that happened? Some people
A lot
came
of
to you.
meetings, a lot of talking, a lot of discussing.
What was the Stan
And,
Rosenberg pitch?
You've been asking for a more open, participatory, engaging environment, and I'm committed to doing that.
And that won people over?
That won a lot of people over, and now we're doing it. Shared leadership.
Was it
You've
more,
heard that phrase
I have
before,
heard that
haven't
phrase
you?
before. You repeat it a lot. It was more, your pitch was more about the way the Senate would function rather than specific policy proposals?
Correct. Yeah.
So people didn't say to you, we want a more progressive agenda on this item or that item. They said,
Some people wanted a more progressive agenda, and some people were worried about maybe we'd have too progressive an agenda. But the main thing that sort of brought people together cross-section was, hey, you've been around, you've got a lot of experience, you produced a lot of good legislation, you took some of the toughest issues, casinos, redistricting, and you navigated those well, and now you're talking about doing what we're asking, which is to open up the Senate more and make it more engaging and more meaningful for us, and that's what they wanted. That's what they were talking about with Senate President Travellini went into office. That's what they were talking about when Senate President Murray went into office, and they were not satisfied that we had done as much as we could in that regard, and they said they believed I would do it, and the proof will be in the pudding.
right after you were formally elected, after you'd locked that up, you spoke to the chamber and to the Commonwealth, and you said, "I grew up as a foster child on the streets of Malden and Revere. If it were not for the Commonwealth, I would have nothing. Collectively, you put clothes on my back, food in my mouth, and a roof over my head. Your childhood's clearly influenced how you see the world and your sense of responsibility. Tell me about it. Your earliest years were in Dorchester, right?
Born in Boston, and then went into foster care. When I went into foster care, moved to Malden, and then from Malden to Revere because of urban renewal, and stayed in the foster care system until I went off to UMass. Got into a number of colleges, but it was the only college that gave me any financial aid, so it was the only college I could go to.
The Globe reported in 1996 that at that time you said you never found out why you were taken away from your biological parents. Has that changed subsequently? Do you know
Nope.
why?
Nope.
Has that question gnawed at you in any way?
Nope.
Just
I'm looking forward, not back.
that same story said you have a twin brother, one of 4 biological siblings. Have you ever been in contact with him or your other siblings?
Not for many years.
Do you ever think about that? Have a sense of regret about it?
Looking forward, not back.
Has that been the way you sort of? I mean, many people who get to a successful position like you have a family to fall back on in tough times.
My family was the community and the people I came into contact with at UMass. Became close to a number of families through politics, through religion, through activity in the community.
And that sort of became.
They became my family, yeah. I think I said that same thing in the Globe,
You
if
did.
I remember correctly.
You did.
How do you like that? Almost 30 years ago.
On message.
And I actually remembered what I said.
You did. You're widely seen as a liberal, and I know you prefer to label yourself as a pragmatist. But
Yep.
I mean, it seems like you're a defender of the power of engaged, benevolent government. I'm wondering how your childhood that we just talked about influenced your political ideology.
Well, as you quoted from the speech on Swearing-In Day, and I think was also reflected in that Globe piece in 1988 or so, the reality is that we live in a commonwealth, not a state. There are 4 commonwealths. It is a state, but if you are a commonwealth, you have a different set of ideas and a different set of values that connect you to other people, to your community, et cetera. And so the fact that the community was there to support and cheer me on when I needed it most and gave me the opportunities that I have, I feel I have an obligation to make that possible for other people.
Why don't you consider yourself a liberal? Anytime someone asks whether you're a liberal, you always say I'm a pragmatist.
Well, because on any given day, based on the issue, you might label me a moderate, you might label me a conservative, even in some situations. I was the guy who was pushing for building up the rainy day fund again. You would have expected either the governor or the House to do that because they're viewed as the more moderate or conservative forces, but it was the Senate and my urging to the governor and the speaker that we take up the rainy day fund. I don't think that's necessarily a liberal idea.
You mentioned.
That's just one example.
Okay. Give me another example where you're conservative.
Let me think about that. I'll get back to you tomorrow.
Okay. Fair enough. You talked about going to UMass Amherst, and it took you a while to graduate.
Yes,
there.
10 years.
Talk to me. 10 years is a long time. Why did it
Yeah,
take
I'm
you
a
so
slow
long?
learner. That's why I'm still in the legislature and why it took me so long to become a chair of a committee. No, basically I was, quote, independent, meaning I didn't have resources. The foster care system at that time, you did not get either free tuition or fees as a former foster kid. That's a great policy that we put in place in the 90s, I think, and then expanded in the 2000s. But at that time, I basically had to make my own way because at 18 I was independent and free of the system, and so I had to find my own path. And as I said earlier, UMass was the only one that gave me some financial aid, but I couldn't do it on just what was available, so I ended up eventually working full-time and going to school part-time, so it took 10 years. And by the way, I managed to do it without writing a single paper.
Tell me how that worked.
I'll get back to you in the morning on that.
You talked a lot about how you're sort of looking forward. You don't think back to what could be described as a troubled childhood. Yeah. At what point were you able to sort of get to the point where you were just focused on looking forward and you didn't think about the difficulties growing up? Was that something right as soon as you got to Amherst?
No, I think it's always been part of my nature and character to look forward. I don't wring my hands over what I can't get done. I focus on what I want to get done and keep moving forward and trying to get it done. And if it doesn't work the first time, I don't give up.
But you're human.
Most of my best legislation took 10 to 20 years.
It's a long time.
It's a long time.
But you're human, and you must feel regret at some things, yeah?
That I can't do more.
That's the main feeling of regret you have.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've been known, partially because you're a graduate and partially because it's been a legislative priority of yours, as one of UMass's strongest defenders, and yet recently you're widely seen as, you're blamed in the State House for failing to include $10 million in key funding for UMass in a recent budget bill. The House included the money in the version it passed, the Senate didn't, and when the bills were reconciled, the money wasn't there. What happened?
Since this is on the record, I can't actually tell you what happened,
Why not?
because that's not how it works.
How does it work?
You say what you have to say when you can say it.
Well,
and
right
you
now,
don't say things that you can't say when, even when you're pressed to do it.
What can you say about the $10 million that were...
We're going to work to try to get that $10 million restored as we go forward.
But what happened? Why didn't it get included in the bill, given that in your history since 1987, you've been a big proponent of UMass and making sure they have the funding
So what
they need?
happened was we delivered tuition retention this year after a 20-year battle that was put in on the Senate side year after year after year after year, and the House rejected it year after year after year after year. This year we finally won it. The governor put in about a $5 million increase in the operating budget for FY16. The House put in, I think, $500,000 more. They basically level funded it. The Senate put in, I think it was $26 million. At the end of the conference process, we were at 18 or 19 million, and the governor vetoed 5.4, and the House and the Senate agreed to override that veto and restore the money.
But that was all before the debate over the $10 million.
And those were the accomplishments for UMass this year, and we're not done.
All right. So you can't say why the $10 million.
Nope. It's your
Okay.
job to figure it out.
Okay. I want to whip through a few more issues in the news, hopefully with more elucidating answers from you.
I'll do my best to be as helpful as I can.
Thank you. There's a pro-pot coalition that's poised to put a question on the ballot in November that would legalize marijuana for recreational use in Massachusetts in November of 2016. Do you support or oppose legalizing marijuana for recreational use in Massachusetts?
I'm conflicted.
Why?
I don't know enough about the subject, which is why we named a special committee of the Senate under the leadership of Senator Lewis, and now 10 members of the Senate are part of that work group now that the signatures have been gathered and that it's going to be placed before the voters. Both the Speaker and the Governor said they're opposed and they don't want it taken up in the legislature, and so it's going to be on the ballot, and that's where it's going to be decided.
You said you're still learning more, but sort of widely known that people who are opposed to it think it's a gateway drug, they worry about the impact on kids, about people driving high and that being dangerous, and proponents say no one's ever died of a marijuana overdose, that pot's objectively safer than alcohol, that prohibition hasn't worked and a regulated market is better than a black market. Given that information, do you generally lean more in favor?
It's not nearly enough information for me to make a decision, and I'll look forward to seeing all of the research that those 10 senators produce so that we can have a very robust and informed discussion, not based on anecdotes or suppositions.
And when
By
you
the way, why are you so obsessed about marijuana?
It's an
Is there
interesting
something
topic.
we should know?
There's nothing you need to know.
Okay, how are you going to vote on that, by the way?
I haven't made up my mind one way or the
Very
other.
good. I'll be happy to share my research with you.
I look forward to it. Thank you. I hope you share it with the whole public. You just got
That's
back.
the plan, actually.
You just got back from Israel. When?
Yes. Sunday morning at 5:30.
How's the jet lag?
Huh? Oh, pretty rough. By the way, what's your name? And where am I? And what am I doing here?
You were there 10 days with your colleagues on a trip paid for in large part by the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston.
Correct.
And that's a group that spent tens of thousands of dollars on Beacon Hill lobbying this year alone. And not long before you left, my colleague Frank Phillips reports that the Senate passed a resolution reaffirming Massachusetts' support of Israel. All that's legal, but doesn't it result in the appearance of impropriety?
Not in my mind.
Why not?
Because it's a study tour that's done annually. They bring people from all walks of life, including legislators, over to a very robust and intense 9-day program of study of the economy, religion, geopolitical matters, et cetera, and it has nothing to do with any of the legislation that they advocate for. They're among the leading organizations promoting social justice and working on human service related and social service related programs. So these are things that the legislature works on all the time anyway, and it's totally two totally different programs.
I mean, but it's the same organization that's paying for lobbying on Beacon Hill that's also paying for you and 9 of your colleagues to go to Israel, right?
They raise money from private sources in order to support study tours for a wide range of individuals, organizations, et cetera.
According to your November 12th filing with the State Ethics Commission, JCRC paid more than $1,000 for your transportation and $3,491 for 10 days worth of meals. Mr. President, what were you eating?
Well, they call all of that meals. Well, I think a lot of that money was actually paid for, paying for the teachers and the professors and the speakers and the armored vehicle and the security and all of that. So I don't know how they break it down, and my staff got the information from them and put it onto the form.
Put it on the form.
Yeah. So,
But
I
it
don't know
wasn't
the
steak
fine
for
detail.
breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Oh, I mean, we had 3 meals a day.
Okay.
And some days we actually had 5, because when you go into, the office of a university president or something, or a mayor of a city, they'll often have tea and cookies out for you.
A reader wrote to me from Arlington, Noble Larson, wrote and asked how you can justify the trip as beneficial to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Because we have strong economic and political and social ties with the state of Israel. We have a significant number of companies that are Massachusetts companies with headquarters here but operations there, and vice versa. We have some significant academic exchange, and there's just so many different ways in which these two small states, if you will, we're almost 7 million people, they're 8.5 million people. They may be a country, but they look a lot like Massachusetts when you look at their economy, you look at their development, you look at their values, you look at how they organize and operate their government.
Give me an example of something you learned there over the 10 days that you can specifically apply to legislation here.
Well, we visited several schools where we saw how they handle the sensitive work of trying to build partnership and communication between groups that have significantly different backgrounds and points of view. We would look at it more from the point of view of race. They look at it more from the point of view of religion.
So how is that something that you could put into legislation?
There were some really excellent models that we saw of how they were running education programs that were outside of the normal and traditional public schools over there, that were sort of akin to some of the stuff we're doing in charter schools and magnet schools and other forms of alternative education.
So it's something that the legislature might put money.
You could potentially do that, but more of it was about stuff around economic development, and we visited 2 incubator centers and saw probably 12 different companies presenting their products and their approaches. So their variation on our Kendall Square, for example, with a lot of young people who were young people who might actually leave those regions after they get their college education because they didn't feel there was anything there for them, and how they were holding those students there by creating these special incubator-type centers, and how they were amassing capital to help fund or provide seed money, and then eventually try to help them move stuff into the market.
So this is more widening legislators' horizons than a
Yes.
specific legislative idea that we
Yeah,
can bring back. They do
right.
this in Israel, we'll do this
Yeah,
in Massachusetts.
absolutely.
And is that mostly what these trips that a lot of your colleagues go on are
Well,
about?
Yeah, well, it just depends. You know, some of the trips are focused on, let's say, climate change. Right now, there's a lot of conferences around the country and around the world that legislators are traveling to so we can see the best practices in other places. Just a couple of months ago, we had half a dozen legislators went off to Denmark to look at offshore wind. The same week that a group of legislators went off to Canada to look at, to Quebec to look at hydro. And so, you know, this is how we learn. I know in this country, this whole idea of travel is labeled as junket, as though it's somehow a really bad thing. In virtually every other government system I've been involved with and I've visited, they value it, they fund it, and they praise legislators for doing this because they're broadening their horizons, they're getting new information, new ideas, and then they're bringing it back. And even some states in the United States, Pennsylvania being a really notable one, and they're kind of in our own wheelhouse, if you think about it, they spend a ton of money supporting the efforts of the legislators participating in trade missions and other forms of international travel in order to build relationships that they expect, not always immediately, but sometimes further down the road in economic relationships.
Do you think senators should do more travel?
Yes,
And who pays for it?
they do mostly on their own or the agencies or organizations that invite them.
And you don't think that creates a conflict of interest or the
Nope.
appearance of one?
Nope,
Okay. I want to talk to you about something that's been in the news.
you apparently do.
No, I'm just
Okay.
curious. There's
Okay.
some outside experts who think that the appearance, at least, is unseemly.
Yeah, well, you know, we moved from a society in which you had to take a bribe to be considered dishonest and corrupt to a society that then said you had to avoid conflicts of interest. Then the laws changed to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest. And now the standard here in Massachusetts is the possibility of the appearance of a conflict of interest. Good luck getting up in the morning. How do you avoid the possibility of the appearance of a conflict of interest? Because if the person wants to see the possibility, they just have to claim that there's a possibility of a perception of a conflict of interest, and you are then guilty because you now have to prove that there's no possibility of the perception of a conflict of interest. I ask you, how do you do that?
Do you think we should lessen the ethics laws we have?
I
here in
think
the
we should be
Commonwealth?
reasonable about our ethics laws, and I think after 30, 40 years, it's appropriate to review and revise.
That evolution you talked about from bribe to the possibility of the appearance of impropriety, you think that evolution is a good one overall?
It's way overreaching,
It's way overreaching.
way overreaching.
Okay.
Because you
So the you
basically
believe the ethics
take
laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are way overreaching?
the regulations
regulation.
and the application of the
So
law is
statute is
way
okay.
overreaching.
Regulations are overreaching.
I believe that that's the case.
Okay. I want to ask you something else that's been in the news lately. Your longtime partner and fiancé, Brian Hefner, told the news organization Politico yesterday that he's considering a run for the soon-to-be vacant Senate seat in the Boston area. If he pulls the trigger on a bid, will you endorse him in the Democratic primary?
He has the right to consider running for public office, as you do. And by the way, you're good enough. I think you should consider that in the future. Would you do that?
No, I'm curious.
You
Curious
wouldn't
to
do
hear
that?
about your fiancé and whether you would endorse him.
Why
in a
wouldn't
Democratic
you
primary.
consider running for public office?
I'm curious to hear about you, Mr. President.
How am I doing, gang? So Brian has the right, like anybody else, to consider running for public office, and he's doing his due diligence, and we'll face that question if he decides to run.
But there's a possibility you wouldn't endorse your fiancé if you were in a Democratic primary?
He is doing his due diligence, and when he completes his due diligence, he'll make a decision, and we'll go from there.
Politico reported that Hefner said he had discussed this potential run with you. What was that conversation like, and did you encourage him?
It was a private conversation.
But the public issue is whether or not he's going to run. Do you think he's going to run?
That public issue is not on my mind.
It's not on your mind?
No.
Okay. Late last year, after the Globe reported that Hefner had used social media to mock outgoing Senate President Terry Murray and had meddled in the internal workings of the Senate, you sent a letter to your Democratic colleagues saying you had, quote, enforced a firewall between the legislative duties and private life. I'm wondering, does that firewall still exist?
Absolutely.
And his thinking about running for Senate doesn't change that?
No.
Okay. Final question for you. My colleague Frank Phillips reported that.
Final question of the evening?
No, on this
Oh,
particular
I see.
topic.
Oh, thank goodness,
there-
only one more.
There, only one more.
Then we can get on to public policy,
Exactly.
which is what I love to talk about.
My colleague reported, according to a Senate source, Hefner was telling Amherst activists he might run against you at one point. Were you aware of that?
Absolutely not. And did they quote somebody? Do they have a source?
It's a Senate source.
Ah. Can you name the Senate source?
I didn't write the story. Turning to another topic, I want to ask you about when you first got to the legislature.
Yep.
This is you in your office, June 24th, 1987. You were a state representative,
Yep.
relatively new state representative. I'm wondering, have you upgraded your TV?
Yes. I have a
Glad
flat
to-
screen on the wall now.
The Globe reported that at that point.
That, by the way, was a TV from an abandoned TV from either a hospital or a hotel room.
Interesting.
I picked it up on the street.
And then brought it into your office.
Well,
All right.
no, that's not my office.
This
that,
is not your
that,
office.
that was the condo. And yeah, I mean, at that point, I took something like a $10,000 pay cut going from one job to the other to come to the legislature. And
You
I
were
was,
a congressional aide, right?
I was congressional aide at that time, yes.
I want to ask you about what you drove. The Globe reported you were driving a Chrysler LeBaron. And
Yes, actually, I was. That was very short-lived.
Yes. How short-lived?
Very short-lived.
Very short-lived.
I had to turn it in because I couldn't afford a Chrysler LeBaron anymore.
What do you drive these days?
A Prius.
A Prius.
Yeah.
All right.
5-year-old Prius.
You've been under
I
the
love
Golden
it.
Dome almost 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
What have been
Wait a
your
minute,
biggest
in
lessons?
office?
In office, yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay.
In office,
Because I
almost 30
actually,
years now.
I stepped foot in there in 1980,
Okay.
so
Well,
I just wanted to clarify.
Take either the almost 30 years or 35 years.
Have
as
I
you
got you
like.
confused here
Not
or
at all.
something? No,
What
okay.
are your biggest lessons? What have you learned the most?
Oh, the people are always right.
And what does that mean?
They make very good decisions, and if they make a mistake, they fix them the next time around.
You say that even as someone who's not a huge fan of ballot initiatives.
That is correct.
Talk to me about
I'm talking about who they select
who they select.
and who they encourage and how they interact with the legislature.
But you believe
But
that
also, you know, ballot questions, in fairness, have to fit into that picture. But I'm not a big fan of ballot questions.
Well, explain to me a little bit more how you believe the people are always right, but you're not a big fan of when they legislate by
Because we have a
referendum.
representative democracy, and the point is you elect representatives, you give them the authority to do the homework, do the work necessary to create good laws that will advance the interests and the needs of the Commonwealth. And ballot questions are very cut and dry. There's 10 people who go into a room. The ballot question reflects their point of view. They rarely, if ever, consult with other stakeholders who disagree with them. They then go out and create a bumper sticker slogan that convinces you as you're rushing into the supermarket that you should sign this petition so that it can get on the ballot. They gather enough signatures, and the legislature either does or doesn't take it up. And then it goes onto the ballot. It can't be amended on the ballot, so it's an up or down vote. And if it's been badly written, as the recreational marijuana question was, we still haven't fully implemented that because it was such a badly written bill, and the legislature refused to go back and go in and fix it because they didn't want to touch it. And most of the time, the legislature leaves ballot questions alone. The only one I can
the
remember...
taxes, income tax.
The income tax. There were two that we changed over the course of the time that I've been in office. One was a small change in what was called the Beaver Bill at the time that controlled how you would deal with beavers that were a nuisance. And after, I don't know, 6 to 10 years of implementation, there was a problem that ended up being fixed. One small problem ended up being fixed through the legislature. But after it was implemented for, probably close to a decade. And then the other one was was the income tax rollback, where the decision was that it would be too much of a shock to the system to take that much money out all at once. And so, and this, remember, follows on approximately 42 tax cuts over about a 5-year period, removing $3.4 billion from the base of our revenue stream. So then this rollback comes along, and the rollback, it was very, very sizable. I forget the exact number, but it was going to be a very substantial hit to the revenue stream. And so the legislature said, okay, we're going to implement it, but we're going to do it in phases as we can absorb it within the economy.
Okay.
So those were the two that we actually amended.
To circle back to the original question, did you have other lessons besides the people are always right?
If you engage people in the conversation, you'll get a better result.
Describe for me an example of that.
Going out and talking to people. The Commonwealth conversations that we just conducted as part of our process of setting the Senate agenda, I think would be a really excellent example of that. We went out and we spent 8 days traveling the state from morning till night each day, and we did all kinds of site visits and seminars and things of that nature, and ended each night with a forum in the community where any resident of the community could come and offer a 2-minute statement about something that was important to them, their family, their business, their community. And we had 175 to 300 people showing up at each of those nights, and we had 60, 70, 80 people a night expressing their opinions. We took all that information and we integrated it into the work we were doing internally to create the Senate agenda.
Your leadership style, you talked about it, is what you sort of sold your colleagues on to be elected president. And it's decidedly different from that of your predecessor. More inclusive, you call it shared leadership.
Actually, my predecessor was moving in that direction, but we got much more, we're moving much more aggressively.
Okay. It's seen as weakness in some quarters of the State House. Does your emphasis on consensus help you get bills through the Senate, but then leave you in a weakened position when you're trying to get them through the House and through the governor's desk?
So we're putting out very good legislation because we're engaging the chairs and the members of the Senate. That is, the Senate chairs and the members of the Senate who are serving on those committees and who also may not be serving in the committees but have an interest in the subject. And we're putting out really good legislation, and some of the bills that actually got to the governor's desk that made it through both the House and the Senate, we improved along the way. So an example, we were criticized for taking too long to do the early retirement bill, but the end result was that we identified some problems and we created solutions. And so even though we took a little bit longer to do it, we ended up with a better product. And in the end, it actually didn't take much longer, if any longer, in the Senate than it took in the House, except we were using the time to improve the bill. So, for me, process is extremely important. Process without a good product is wasted effort, but a good process can lead to a better product, and I think you're finding that if you keep watching what we're producing and how we're producing it. I think you'll find that we're getting a lot of work done, and in spite of the fact that we're using this more participatory process. Transparency is very important, both inside the body and outside with the public.
But just to circle back on the question, does your emphasis on consensus and transparency help you get bills through the Senate, but then make it more difficult to get them into law?
Well, the House will have to decide which bills they're going to take up. Not all bills that get approved in the House will pass the Senate, and vice versa. We're early in the session, we're early in the term, and as I said, we've sent a lot of really good legislation. In fact, your newspaper has editorialized on several of them and called for their passage. So they're good bills, but we can only be responsible for what we do in the Senate.
But surely there's a component of the job that involves working with the two other big players.
Oh,
to
sure,
move
and
things into
we're
law.
working very well together, and we're getting a lot accomplished.
What is your relationship with Speaker DeLeo like?
It's fine.
Can you elucidate that a little more?
Yeah, we like each other. We have dinner together. We have lunch together. We talk. We're doing fine.
Okay. How about with Governor Baker?
We're doing great.
Is there a difference that I should be hearing between doing fine and doing great?
No, I got tired of saying fine.
Okay. Let me ask you the question I was trying to ask before in a different way. In big speeches, Governor Baker and Speaker DeLeo tend to be pretty clear about what they intend to accomplish. And I noticed in many of your speeches you tend to float ideas rather than make declarative, decisive statements. For example, at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce event in April, you expressed hope that Massachusetts would consider replicating a Texas program that diverts some nonviolent offenders with substance abuse problems.
Yeah, leadership in my form of...
But you didn't say we should do that.
Yeah, leadership is guiding in my way of doing things, in my view of the world, as opposed to directing. There will be times when the body needs some direction, and I have to be prepared to do that with the leadership team. The leadership team meets roughly once a week with me, and we talk about agenda, we talk about how things are going, we talk about ways to improve things, because we're transitioning the body. We're reforming how we do business in the Senate, and so we need to work closely together to identify the agenda and to make these changes and to make them work. And my form of leadership is centered on guiding rather than directing.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, if I'm hearing sort of the shadows of what you're saying, you don't see it as weakness. Your way of doing it, you see it rather as strength.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
We
So-
have the most centralized control among all the legislatures in the country. If you look at, so here we're going to get nerdy here for a second. We're at a university, so I guess I'm allowed to do that.
I think you're allowed to do that.
So Professor, I think it was Rosenthal, who passed away a few years ago, but he spent his life researching legislatures out of Rutgers University, and he said basically in his research he identified that there were like 12 or 13 tools that legislatures use to manage themselves and to be effective. And in the Massachusetts legislature, every one of those tools is in the hands of the Speaker and the Senate President. In virtually every other legislature in the country, those powers are dispersed. Some are in the hands of the presiding officer, some are in the hands of the majority leader, some are in the hands of the members, some are in the hands of certain committees that have authority to do various things that would here in Massachusetts otherwise be controlled in the center. And it proves in other states that you don't have to have that structure to be effective.
Do you want to change that structure?
I'm in the process of doing it.
Talk to me a
That's
little
what
bit.
shared leadership is all about.
This has been called a slow legislative year, and you may agree or disagree with that. But are you going to push once again to restructure the committee process with the House, which is essentially a joint committee process for people who don't know, with most House and Senate committees being one joint committee with a House chair and a Senate chair? Are you going to try to restructure that process to give the Senate more power?
So we've been in discussions. We have a conference committee, and that conference committee has the opportunity to resolve the difference of opinion between the House and the Senate on the question of the flow of legislation out of committees. And there are two main issues that we're trying to address. One is trying to get more legislation out earlier and have legislation return to the body of origination. And most legislation does return to the body of origination, but not all. And in my opinion, and based upon past history, it was far more common for, let me put it differently, it was far less common to have bills put to study, and it was far less common to have bills, I'm trying to remember the term, extension orders. So we use extension orders.
What's that? Just in layman's terms, explain to me what you're saying.
Okay, so under the rules, you're supposed to have a public hearing, and by the third Wednesday in March of the second year of the term, all the bills have to come out of committee, either favorable, unfavorable, or to study. And the practice of doing extension orders, meaning saying we want these bills to stay in committee for another 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, was in the past unheard of. It was almost never done.
Okay.
Now it's done very routinely. And so that's one of the ways of tying bills up in the committee and keeping them from moving back to the branch of origination, whether the House or the Senate.
So your hope is that if there are no longer joint committees, if the Senate has their own committee, bills wouldn't be trapped in there?
We love joint committees. We don't think they're working right. We don't think they're working well.
So you want to get rid of them?
We are co-equal. We're co-equal branch of government. Because the House has more members than the Senate, they obviously are going to have more members on the Joint Committee than the Senate. So therefore, they can control the flow of legislation out of the committee. We would like to see bills come out at a faster rate, and we'd like to see them come back to the branch of origination and come back earlier so that we can actually work on them.
I want to ask you about a few other issues outside of the nitty-gritty of Beacon Hill. You were instrumental in crafting the state's casino gambling law.
I was.
And it was premised on, I mean, one of the premises was bringing in a lot of tax dollars to Massachusetts. State officials have now chopped by nearly 40% the amount of tax revenue that is expected from the state's first casino in Plain Ridge that it's going to generate. How solidly can you include gambling revenue in budgets going forward given this? And do you think legalizing casino gambling was a mistake?
Well, let's start with the second question.
Okay.
No, it was not a mistake. What was driving the legalization of casino gaming in Massachusetts was Governor Patrick's realization, which was actually fulfilled, that the federal government was soon to recognize the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe as a federally recognized tribe, at which time, under federal law, they would be allowed to open gambling on their land without state regulation, taxation, or interference, and that is a bad thing. And the Mashpee Wampanoag themselves said it was a bad thing, especially if they were just going to be able to do slot parlors and not casinos, because slot parlors create very few jobs, and as you're seeing how it's playing out in Plain Ridge, it's not an ideal form, because what people want are resort casinos. They want the glitz and the glamour and all of the bells and whistles, and they want the spas, and they want the theater, and they want the this and the that and the other, and fancy restaurants, and walking around big buildings with lots of lights and all of this. So this is premature to judge whether we're going to do okay or not on the revenue side, because all we have so far is one slot parlor.
You said that Plain Ridge is not the ideal form. Is that a problem with the legislation that you have put into law?
No, it's slot parlors by definition attract certain types of players. People are not going to fly in from another state to visit your slot parlor. People come in, people who love to gamble and to visit states or go to conventions. They don't want to go to slot parlors. They want to go to resort casinos.
I want to talk charters with you quickly. You had a facilitator come in.
But by the way, we should not be spending the money until it starts coming in.
Okay. That seems reasonable to me.
That's it.
You had a facilitator come in to help with the
Yes.
discussion in the Senate about charter schools.
Charter schools, yeah.
What is a facilitator?
A facilitator is a professional person who can help a group walk through a complicated discussion and allows everybody in the room to participate, including the person who would otherwise be presiding over the meeting.
Which would be you.
Would have been me.
Okay. So it allowed you to participate in the conversation.
I wanted to be able to participate in the meeting.
And did you come away from it believing that through some mechanism, either by voters at the ballot box next year or through legislation, that Massachusetts should raise the cap on charter schools?
So the bill failed in the Senate last year
It
by
did.
a very wide margin, and the reason it failed also became apparent in the discussion this year in that caucus you just referenced, because for 20 years, it's a 20-year-old experiment, and there are some issues that have been raised repeatedly which have gone unaddressed and just been swept aside. And some of them are operational, such as admission and retention, and whether you're performing at the appropriate level in terms of ensuring that there's support and appropriate programs for English as a second language and special needs students. And some of them relate to transparency, but the big enchilada is the question of finance and how these are funded. And what's happened is in Massachusetts, we adopted a model where the money follows the child out of the public school if they go to a charter school. And that basically is dividing communities and dividing people around the question of whether their kids are not getting the education they need because of the stranded costs that don't get taken care of when a child leaves the school and goes to another school system. And it's particularly severe in rural and low-income areas where if 5 kids leave the 3rd grade, you can't close down a classroom because 16 kids didn't leave. And so there are problems of this sort that need to be dealt with, and we are in the process of talking with all of the senators to try to figure out if there is a path forward. It's on the ballot, so the people will have the opportunity to vote on it, and the question is, will we find resolve in the Senate to be able to try to move forward?
It sounds like from some of your previous comments and from what you're saying this evening, you have some doubts about whether raising the charter cap further is a good idea. Is that fair?
I voted for it every time it was on the ballot with reluctance because I kept trying to get these kinds of problems that I've raised addressed. And finally, what happened last year was Senate President Murray said, hey, vote your districts. And when people were freed to vote their district, they voted their districts. And their districts are struggling across the Commonwealth. Not every district, but many districts are struggling with charter schools. So the jury is out whether we can get there, but we're going to give it a real honest try to figure out whether there's a configuration that will work.
What's the time frame when you expect it to happen?
I'm hoping that we can figure this out within the month of January, and then if we feel we can move forward, I'm hoping we can get it moving within a couple of months after that. I can't swear to that, but we know we have a July 6th deadline in order for the people who have a ballot question on
pull it off.
to pull, which doesn't mean that we would necessarily get to the point where they would be satisfied, but our first question is, can we satisfy ourselves that we can produce a piece of legislation we can stand behind?
I know you're headed off in not so long to a screening of a movie about the opioid crisis
Yes.
across Massachusetts. When do you expect legislation to be signed into law to address that issue? The Senate has passed a version. The governor has proposed a version. What's your expectation of timing? Obviously,
Well,
this is an issue
first-
that continues to.
I often say I'm not looking back, but I want to look back for just a minute here because I don't want
Change of tune.
I don't want your viewers to come away with the misimpression that nothing's been done. We've actually been passing pieces of legislation and policies and spending plans as part of a number of budgets over the last year. So we've actually done 3 separate things that have, or packages that have actually gotten to the governor's desk, been signed into law, and are being implemented. Those mostly have focused on treatment and aftercare and some things around insurance and insurance coverage, and the House bill on fentanyl trafficking. So those are already in law and they're being played out. You point out correctly, the Senate did a bill, I think it was in September, and the governor filed a bill a little bit after that, maybe sometime early October, mid-October, and it did not get, neither the Senate bill nor the governor's bill got to the House floor prior to our break. So right now the ball's in the House court. The governor and the Senate are on the same page, which is it's time to now look at prevention. And we have a number of tools in our bill. He has a number of tools in his bill. And probably the most significant piece would be reducing the number of pills in the initial prescription so that we could reduce the number of pills that are on the street, because this crisis is really being generated by people becoming addicted to the pills, either the prescription they received or someone else getting access to their prescription. So we want to cut off excess distribution of pills.
Do you have a feeling about whether the speaker is on board with that as well?
I don't know.
Do you talk to him about things like this? You know, bills that are pending in your lunches and your
Sometimes
dinners?
we do, yeah.
Is this one of the ones
but
you
we
talked
haven't
about?
gone in depth on this.
And you expect that to do that in January?
It balls in his court.
But you don't press him on something like this once the Senate passes it. You don't bring it up.
You know,
until
I'm hoping we'll go out for dinner or lunch sometime in early January, and I'm sure that'll be on the agenda. But you know, we don't always drill down onto the provisions of the bill. You know, a lot of it is, are we going to take this up? Are we going to take that up? Do we think we can do this early? Do we think we have to wait longer? Blah, 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 blah. So it's not always drilling down on the particular policies.
And do you have a personal relationship with him too? Do you ever hang out just not talking business? The speaker?
You know, we're new to each other because we never actually served together. So we're getting to know each other
Through these dinners and lunches.
through these dinners and lunches and our weekly leadership meetings.
What goes on inside those meetings?
A lot of very interesting conversation.
We have. I want to ask you a few more questions before we get to ones from our audience.
Oh, can I pick the ones?
I'm sorry. Only if you can give
How
me a
come
few
you
more
get
examples.
to pick all the questions?
Only if you
and I
give me a
never
few
get
more
to pick
examples
any?
of where you're conservative. You told me to come back to that later in the program.
Yeah, I said another day.
Oh, another day. Oh, all right. It would be malpractice.
I think I said another day, didn't
It would be malpractice at a happy hour if I didn't ask you what you usually like to drink when you're relaxing with friends.
Oh, I'm a bourbon.
What kind?
Am I allowed to say that?
Yes.
Okay. When I'm at Carey Nation, I like Angel's Envy.
Okay.
And most other places, it would be Woodford, Knob Creek, or Makers.
All right. And since we are at a happy hour, would you like to make a toast?
To a happy and healthy new year to you and all of the other 7 million people who live here in Massachusetts.
I'll drink to that. I'll drink to that. Let's give a big round of applause to Senate President Stan Rosenberg, and I'll ask one or two questions from our audience. I'm just going to read this cold. I haven't seen these before. Yesterday, the Globe called Governor Baker Mr. Fix-It as the Senate President who rose through the concept of shared leadership. How does the Democratic Party view and acknowledge conservative ideas, issues, and policies shared by all or just some?
So I don't speak for the Democratic Party. I'll only speak for myself as a Democrat and as a member of the Democratic caucus in the Senate. This year was about management. The governor had to put together a government and assemble his cabinet. He inherited big problems at the MBTA. We had those big snowstorms. He had to manage the snowstorms. He had to manage the T. We had to deal with the connector problem, which he inherited. There were problems at the Department of Revenue. There was a technology system that wasn't functioning. There was another technology situation over at EEC. So this was an opportunity for him to shine because those were all management problems. And, you know, he's a very strong manager, and he got his opportunity to show that. I think next year is going to be a little bit different because we're going to get much more into policy, and that's where I think you'll start to see maybe some more differences of opinion emerging. And the bottom line for that is we should have robust debate and conversation. But as we said at the beginning, we need to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. So if we start disagreeing on policy, if we start looking at policy and we see disagreements, it's going to become clearer who are the Democrats and who are the Republicans, and we will go from there.
Well, what grade would you give him so far? He took office January 8th, and it's December 15th.
He's doing a terrific job.
Okay. One more question here, final one for you. What is the
I'll pay for that later, by the way.
What, I'm sure you will. It's on video. What is the most important change you'd like to see in the Senate before you leave office?
In the Senate or in the Commonwealth as a result of the work of the Senate?
Feel free to pick. You finally get a chance to pick your question.
Okay, so I would like to see us make significant progress in addressing income inequality and all of the elements of that, from student loan debt to cost of health care and energy, and all of the inputs into personal budgets, which are stressing families. Also would like to see us working with the private sector to bring our compensation packages and benefits and all of that more in line with the real needs and problems that people face. I grew up in an era where we sort of peaked around 1978, and so when I was growing up, you know, the world was our oyster. Everybody knew that if you worked really hard, you could really make some progress in your life, et cetera. And the differential between the top and the bottom was 34-1. And from 1978 to now, the incomes of roughly 90% of the population are either barely keeping up with the cost of living, or in fact diminishing for a substantial portion of people. So more and more people are basically not keeping up with the cost of living, even as the top 10%, and the higher you go within that top 10%, more and more concentrated wealth.
Mr. President, Stan Rosenberg, thanks so much for being here. Thank you all for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Thank you for joining us online. And we'll have a final word from John.
Thank you.
I'm sure we'd all like to thank Senate President Stanley Rosenberg for sharing his thoughts, his ideas, his vision with us this evening. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And of course, we thank Josh Miller for the usual great job of insightful and informed questioning to make this happen. Thank you all very much for attending here tonight. We want to wish you a very happy holiday season, and we hope you'll pay attention. Stay tuned to the Boston Globe and to Suffolk University for our details on our next in this series of political happy hours, which will be in January with Congressman Stephen Lynch. Until then, thanks very much and good night.